So, hi everyone. Welcome to this breakout session, which is the climate mitigation in Latin America, the Mexico case. So we're going to be talking to you about kind of like the broad strokes of Latin America and then narrowing it down to Mexico. So I'll be one of the speakers today. My name is Isatis Cintron. I have the pleasure of coordinating Latin America. I'm also a PhD student and I study climate change, very specifically like atmospheric chemistry. So the transport of contaminants from, from all of our areas to the polar regions. And yeah, and like in my free time, then I do like this organizing, which like fulfills me a lot. Also, I will have Gabriela Mena from Mexico. She's a volunteer of CCL Mexico, and she's working in the policy analysis working group of the chapter. So quickly, to review, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be reviewing the climate mitigation targets in Latin America. We're going to examine some of the distributional impacts and principles for carbon pricing. And then we're going to review the Mexico current carbon pricing policies. So you have more or less of an agenda. We're in the breakout rooms. We're going to have presentations, then discussions, and then we're going to go back to the international session. I just want to remind you that like we're all aiming to go back there to be all together. So climate mitigation targets in Latin America. So mitigation targets take the form of an NDC, and you might be familiar, you might be asking, what is an NDC? So an NDC is a nationally determined contribution and are the action that countries plan to fulfill the Paris Agreement. So this contribution addresses climate change in a way that is aligned with the circumstances and priorities of their country. This terminology was adopted to emphasize the bottom-up approach so that nations can determine what they can do, the nature of their contributions to make a global effort to address climate change, as opposed to top-down, where the approach is determined globally. So there are two types of contributions. One is conditional and the other one is unconditional. Some parties require the provision of international support for the full implementation of their NDC, whereas others include an enhanced conditional mitigation component alongside an unconditional one. So some of these requirements are capacity building, technology transfer, finance, or collective ambition. So how does that look? In Latin America, we have then 65% of the contributions of Latin America are fully or partially conditional. Most of these are in the areas of finance, of mitigation finance for developing countries or all types of countries to receive support to be able to implement this contribution. So the Latin American context. So we have a lower capita emission compared to other regions. We're talking about 12%. About the energy sector, we have that 30% of the region. It is 30% of the regional emissions, whereas in global that is 40%. However, in transport, we see the other like the opposite trend. So transport is responsible for 29% of the emission profile of the Latin American and Caribbean region, while the global average is 19, which is explained by the high level of urbanization in the region. So these are some of the, this is a lot. So these are what the countries have put forward. So what we can see here is that with increased support or increased ambition overall the countries, we see an increase of the amount of mitigation that the countries can take. So So we have all the countries here. I'm not gonna go specifically under each one of them, but it's very exciting to see what the countries have put forward. So in the NDC implementation, a very specific point of it, like a tool that they use is carbon pricing. So this is the carbon prices that have been established or implemented or are under consideration in Latin America. We see that Brazil it's under consideration. We see that Argentina has implemented a carbon tax or a schedule. We see that Chile is trying to see like how the carbon tax and the ETS that is under consideration. In Mexico, we see that they have implemented a pilot of the ETS and have established already a carbon tax, and then Colombia is similar to Chile. And here I'm showing what are the levels of the carbon pricing, like how much are they pricing the ton of CO2. So we see that it's pretty low. We have Argentina with 10, Chile and Colombia with $5 per ton, and Mexico with $2.5 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So we're gonna talk about how the numbers or the pricing can accomplish low emission scenarios, even though they are in a low level. Moving forward. So in the international negotiations, there are a couple of concerns that countries put forward when we're talking about implementing carbon pricing in the international context. So we're talking about double counting and corresponding adjustments. This is like carbon credits, and just like overall concern that the mitigation in global emissions is true to the objective that we have, and it's not selling credits or providing avenues for countries to sneak out some of their mitigation objectives to try to sell these credits. So in developing countries, we need to have several considerations about carbon pricing, since sustainable development prospect is very important. And the UNFCCC says that measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. So what we're talking when we talk about the BCA is that global trade can influence the economic development of a country. So it is no surprise that developing countries have concerns about restricted market access. So technically what they're saying is like, oh, this will enhance the divide on the divide between developed and developing countries. So I want to emphasize that when we're fighting for global climate, we have to think about the context of the entire planet emissions, and not just in our cities or in our countries. And pricing greenhouse gases harnesses the power of market incentive to move away from fossil fuels. But that in itself has some social and political political challenges that we need to accept. So in doing this, and also under like the UNFCCC, they say like parties must take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing countries. So when we're trying to establish any type of carbon pricing or international cooperation, this needs to be development oriented, so that the outcome of these also push forward those development or like non-climate goals, and need to take into consideration that are limited international transfers. And this is, this is true that we can see in any kind of conversation about foreign aid. And also take into consideration the macroeconomic effects, for example, with countries that rely heavily in the energy sector, means that some of these fluctuations might affect more closely a vulnerable communities. So what normally is proposed is that the emissions objectives are aligned with other goals. And then from there is that countries decide what is the price level that they need to achieve those emissions reduction. So when we're talking about carbon pricing, we need to talk about, okay, so how do we ensure that there's like social protection? And one way is through compensations. This can mean cash transfer or tax reductions. And also we need to think about the efficiency and feasibility of our proposal. So that needs to take into consideration the market failures on social political circumstances. So complementary policies can reduce the necessity of the carbon price level. And the principles, that I want you to take away is that it needs to be faster. So that is fairness, alignment of policies and objectives, stability and predictability, transparency, efficiency and cost effectiveness, reliability, and environmental integrity. And just to wrap it up, because I don't want to take too much time. So other approaches include having a global incentive fund where countries will decide on an emission threshold, and whoever emits more will need to compensate the countries that are emitting below that. And some regional initiatives have been trying to connect the ETS between Quebec, Canada, California, US, and Mexico. Some of these, for example, in the ETS that we're looking at in California, is that the macroeconomic fluctuations sometimes have a greater impact than the level of cap that we have. So that is something to take into consideration when we're talking about ETS. I wish I could have more time to talk to you, but with that, I will pass the mic to Gabby.
Thank you. Well, welcome to the third part of this presentation workshop. As I said before, I'm Gabriela Mena and I work in the Mexico CCL team. So in order for us to present to you a little bit about what Mexico is currently working on, we've devised the following agenda. First, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the Mexico and Latin American geopolitical context. Then I'm gonna talk to you briefly about what Mexican current carbon pricing policies are. As Isatis mentioned, we have currently 2 in place. So I'm gonna share with you a little bit of the key summary points about each of these instruments. And finally, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about what Mexico CCL is doing, what the CCL chapter in Mexico is up to these days, and the policy analysis we've been working on lately. So let's start with the first item. So Isatis, can you please Tammy, can you please share the next slide? So first, I'm going to provide to you a regional and national context overview. And as we can see in the next slide, so the first thing that I would like to highlight is that a lot of problems that we find in Mexico could also be extended to a certain degree to Latin America. For example, the economies in these countries tend to be extractivist economies. What does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of our economic activity depends to a large extent on extractivist sectors, for example, oil and gas sectors or mining sectors, that, as you are well aware of, these sectors have a high level of emission output. So it's very difficult because our economies are trying to migrate to sustainable models and more green models, but we do have to be realistic about the fact that our economies very much rely on these extractivist industries. Also, the regions with a lot of political instability, like political winds come and go, and sometimes they delay or change the framework that already exists there, the little framework that we've managed to put forward to help climate change. Sometimes it gets stalled because of the government signals to the market. And of course, then investors are shied away from a lot of our countries because then they perceive our countries as an investment risk. So we need this money to come to our countries and invest in certain things like technology transfer and R&D. But of course, we have to give them a climate and a legal framework in which they can feel their investments is secure. And last but not least, there's like a lack sense of urgency in public's eye when it comes to climate change things, because it seems like on a week-to-week basis, we go from addressing one humanitarian crisis to the other. So it's very, very hard to keep the attention of the public focus on climate change and how important it is to solve it when, for example, in Mexico, these were the type of headlines we were looking at in 2020. You know, we have increasing murder rates, we have key areas that are now being defunded, you know, areas like protection, environmental agencies, and we also have certain institutes that provide a lot of useful groundwork for policy analysis that have been defunded as a consequence of this new government. And of course, corruption is also a huge problem that we have. And I'm sure that if there are any other Latin American countries in the region, they can relate to this. Honestly, like every week to week, we are jumping from one crisis to another. So it's very hard to keep the public's attentions around fixing climate change. In the case of Mexico, despite having all these problems, institutional and systemic problems, we've managed to push forward a legal framework that supports carbon pricing. To this end, the Mexican law has issued two very environmental key pieces of legislation. One is the General Law of Climate Change, or LGCC. Sometimes I'll refer to it as LGCC, but it's basically our climate change law. And we have the Energy Transition Law. The first law, the Law of Climate Change, is a very, very front-forward instrument because Mexico was the second country in the world to issue an instrument of its kind. The UK was the first one. And in this law, the Mexican government basically sets up a roadmap about how they are gonna implement or make the Paris Agreement commitments a reality, you know, how we're gonna decarbonize the economy. And that is basically what the LGCC envisions. And on the other hand, we have the Energy Transition Law, which is exactly a law that is supposed to provide a roadmap to the Mexican government regarding how are we supposed to change our energy matrix to be less centered around fossil fuels and slowly transition to a more renewable energy energy matrix. So these two instruments together enable the first emission trading system in Latin America, our ETS. It's a good step forward in the right direction. However, we are aware that it has a lot of areas of opportunity. We know also that a lot of Latin American countries, since they're considering right now implementing an ETS, they're closely looking at what Mexico is doing and trying to learn from our mistakes and the things we managed to get right. But all this package of law was basically emitted around 2014, around that area. But since then, the situation has changed for the worse, unfortunately. We have a new administration whose whole political agenda is fostered around the development and fostering of the fossil fuel sector. So that means that he has put now in jeopardy a lot of the plan that was set forward for the energy transition. Right now, around 89% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. So certain decisions or announcements he has made lately has shied away the investments that were coming into the country for renewable energy. And he has also enacted or banned a lot of environmental policies that used to be a reality. And now we're seeing a lot of movements or direction of the new government towards the place where we don't want to be on, where we are trying to escape from. I took the liberty of putting here some headlines that we saw from our president this year. AMLO is our president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and as you can see, there is growing concern, not only in a Mexican level, but an international level, about what the current direction of the new Mexican government is. So now I'm gonna talk to you about Mexican carbon policies. We have two carbon policies, a carbon tax and an ETS. So if we can share to the next slide, please. I will first talk to you about the carbon tax. The carbon tax in Mexico is also sometimes referred to as JEPS because that's the Mexican name. When the Mexican government first enacted this tax, they say that they wanted this tax to have two objectives. On one hand, they wanted to reduce CO2 emissions, and the other one was that they wanted to increase government revenues. Until now, we haven't found a reliable source that says exactly how many emissions the government was planning on removing through the carbon tax. But I found a source that says that the government is trying that through this tax, they would be able to remove 1.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. but it doesn't sound right because that would mean that they are only planning on removing around 0.2% of our total greenhouse gas emissions a year. So I want to believe that number is wrong. And the second thing is that they want to, of course, increase their government revenue. One thing that we have to understand is that in Latin America, governments allow for economy to grow in such a way that now it has gotten out of their hands. You know, they saw that it was a good way to have people jobs, but now it has grown to such extent that now they're having a lot of problem regulating it and therefore taxing or applying a tax to that sector. So of course, this tax, the carbon tax, has become a very key important source of income for the Mexican government right now. Some key characteristics about this tax is that where on one hand, it was established in 2014. It's not an economy-wide tax. It means that it's only applied almost to the sale point, and it is determined according to the carbon content, similar to what Ross presented to us. They just basically determine what the greenhouse emission potential is, or the CO2 emission potential is of this fuel once it gets burned, and based on that, they establish these rates. There are two important exceptions that the Mexican law has made for now, and it doesn't apply to natural gas and it doesn't apply to kerosene. And this was a decision that was taken after the private sector decided that they were not going to accept it unless that exception was included in the law. Now I'm going to talk about the Mexican emission trading scheme. As I mentioned before, the legal basis that allows such instrument to exist is the General Law of Climate Change. It is the first ETS system in Latin America. So we are proud, but not entirely proud. We know we can do a lot better than this. Or at least we can work on fixing it because it has a lot of problems, as I will tell you about in the next slide. This system is supposed to start operations in 2022. Right now it's ongoing in a pilot phase. It's important to mention that it only applies to the industry and the energy sector. And I included this table because I wanted to show you how our Mexican ETS during its trial period, like I said, it's only gonna start in 2022, compares to other ETS systems in other jurisdictions. One of the main things that I want to highlight is that the greenhouse coverage of the Mexico system right now is very low when we compare it to the California or the South Korea emission trading schemes. Also, our ETS system right now only covers CO2. Hopefully it would extend to other greenhouse gases, but we're not entirely sure what the government is thinking, at least not me. Right now, there are around 308 companies participating in this pilot. However, we are well aware that the uptake could be increased. You know, we want like more companies to jump on board the system, and that right now it only targets the industry and the energy sector. So of course, transport is the next obvious choice, but we'll see how that goes. And the cap, which is a very important key aspect of an ETS system, hasn't been defined. The Mexican government says that they're going to see how the pilot and the figures work out to be this year and next year. And then based on those figures, they will decide what that emission limit is going to look like. And similar to other ETS systems around the world, the Mexican ETS system does allow for auctions and offsets, which are mechanisms by which companies can either allow purchase or sell the emission trading permits that they either have to sell or buy. So last but not least, now I'm going to talk a little bit about what Mexico CCL has been doing. Basically, I joined 6 months ago, so I can tell you about what we've been doing since then. The Mexico team, we're right now basically focusing a lot into identifying the key actors that can help us push this carbon fee and dividend forward. We have been also had the first meeting or approach to Congress with a representative from the Climate Coalition leader. But most importantly, we have been doing a lot of policy analysis, and this is what I'm going to talk to you in this last part. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the journey we have been doing since 6 months ago. First, we have to mention that Mexico wants, of course, like our preferred policy is to push for a carbon fee and dividend, right? But first, we wanted to take a step back and then understand the legal framework. What are the laws that exist there? What does it allow us? Why it doesn't allow us? And we wanted to understand if there was a provision in the law that allowed market mechanisms to be put in place in order to price carbon pricing and reduce emissions. So we took a deep dive into reading all this legislation that is fairly new, because our end game was that we wanted to identify a legal basis for a carbon fee and dividend. We wanted to know if the current legislation gives us some sort of room to start seeing where we can build upon. Alongside this exercise, we found that there were two carbon policies. I mean, we were aware of them, but we had no idea of the current scope and objectives and everything like that. So now we took actually time to understand it, see what other people are saying, the voices, and see what they feel about these two instruments. And once we had the analysis, we had to think about, okay, this is the analysis, we have these two options, these are the key characteristics. We are seeing this geopolitical context in Mexico, and we're very well aware that climate action is needed now. So if we take into account all these three things, where do we go from here? Like, we are really in a place where we have to choose. We are at crossroads that I would like to present to in the next slide. Yeah, so we're basically deciding where to go from here, because of course, ideally we would keep pushing for a carbon fee and dividend. This is our preferred option. We also play around with the idea with, okay, what will happen if, given that Mexico already has an emission trading system that took between 5 to 7 years, or it will take 5 to 7 years to become a reality. What happens if we build a carbon fee in dividend on top of it? Like, could these two instruments coexist? And we have had very interesting conversations with Harry Chomsky regarding this aspect, where he has told about his ideas about how a carbon fee and dividend and an ETS system could coexist in California, for example. So we thank him a lot for this. And on the other hand, we have an emission trading scheme, which is already in reality. You know, it took a lot of political action to get everyone on board and sit down on the table and be like, okay, we're gonna agree to these instruments. And since a lot of secondary regulation hasn't been issued yet, that means that it could still be tweaked, you know? So the Mexican government is still figuring out the details. So at least from my perspective, we haven't seen any NGO or anyone that's right now raising these concerns about how it could be better. You know, like, we've identified like a couple of things in how we think the system could be made more stringent and how the uptake could be increased. So, so that's what we have figured out about the ETS so far. However, once we saw our two options in the table, we decided, you know what, maybe we need to take a step back and see our two options, and then identify the proper trade-offs between choosing one option over the other. So to this end, we've done a lot of homework. We've read a book called by Hal Harvey called Designing Climate Solutions. And it's a very comprehensive guide about how policymakers should decide which policy they want to go on. And he says that in order to decide which policy is better, you really have to assess them to a set of criteria. So he suggests, for example, that we should take into account the following 5 criteria in order to make this decision. On one hand, we should take a look at these policies from their greenhouse emission reduction potential. How many CO2 equivalent tons per year is each policy projected to reduce, which I haven't seen the homework being done so far as I'm concerned. We also have to take into account the economic impact because of the characteristics of the region, you know, not only from a macroeconomic level, but also from the family's perspective and income distribution. We also want to take into account the political viability of these two options, because right now our Congress is captured for our current president. So that might change this year, but we don't know what the outcome is gonna be. We also have to take into account energy security, because we don't wanna push any type of policy that in any way endangers our energy provision. And finally, we want to identify what other public health and other co-benefits can each of these policies get. In order to assess this criteria, we're planning on hosting several meetings or sessions with experts or different voices that can help us grasp an idea of how these criteria rank. And finally, once we have this huge analysis, we'll finally able to identify the trade-offs. Yeah, so now I'm finally moving up to conclusion, because I know that time is running up. When it comes to Mexico as a leader in a country, well, we are very well aware that the legal framework is there. We know that our legislators at the time were thinking in the right direction. However, there has been tons of problems in the execution, and I think we should really focus on that. The law envisions certain mechanisms by which policies could be improved, so we can definitely take advantage of them. And the most worrisome aspect of the current direction of the Mexican government is that I know, or at least I've become aware, that a lot of Latin American countries are looking at Mexico as one of the leaders of the region. They want to learn from our example. And given the current Mexican government direction, we're really starting to put ourselves in a position where we could risk being that leader, which we very much would like to be. And well, finally, about what we'll continue to do in CCL Mexico, well, we've come to understand through this whole exercise that carbon pricing operates as part of a broader fiscal and political landscape. And this is very much a lesson that we've very drilled into for the last few months. And based on that, we've become very aware that we have to plan very strategically, because in the CCL Mexico team, we're 5 people, 5 great people, but we of course have to be very, we have to be considerate of our resources and pick our battles wisely. We have to navigate complexity, because it seems, or our impression is, that there's now this my English, that the authorities have built when it comes to knowledge. So there very much exists a regulatory capture, where basically the regulatory entities are only listening, or mostly listening, to the companies, which of course is important, but we also citizens want a seat at the table. But of course, these conversations can turn technical very quickly. So we're trying to educate ourselves and navigate amidst all this complexity. And finally, after all this analysis, we'll hope that we'll be able to identify the trade-offs between choosing one path or the other. Of course, we will always do it being mindful of CCL's ultimate objectives and preferred way. And well, I hope you enjoy my presentation. That's everything on my behalf. Please, if you have any comments or thoughts regarding what Mexico is doing, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone in the CCL Mexico team. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand now the mic to Isatis or Tammy. Thank you.
Hi, yes, so right now we're going to do an exercise. So for this next exercise, please complete the following poll, and you will be assigned in virtual discussions of 5 participants. So in those sessions, you will first introduce yourself, and then each participant will share which of these 4 options you voted for and why. We need a facilitator, so the participant in the breakout room, first in alphabetical number, that would be the facilitator of the group. Thank you for volunteering. If you have any problems in the breakout sessions, there is a button that you can click and ask for help, and someone will enter the session to assist. Please make sure that the initial contributions are a minute or less, so you have a few additional minutes to discuss, and then we will return here and we will repoll again to see if listening to other arguments have changed your preference. We're gonna have 13 minutes for the initial discussion, and then when we come back, we're gonna have some of you share your reasoning. So if we can have the polling, Tammy. So I will read them. So as the climate diplomat, so we're just playing that we're all here representing Mexico. Which of these 4 diplomacy strategies do you prefer to pursue with the United States? So with this, we will all go back to Ross in the main session to tell US what we need to do or what we intend to do. So the first one is to suspend the BCA imports from our country. The second one is to link the ETS system, the emission trading system of California and Mexico. And then the third one is support the creation of a global carbon incentive fund that compensates low emitting countries. And the fourth one is thank you for calling US. Please enhance your climate action. We'll talk after that. So from these questions or these options, then you can decide which one you think would be most fruitful. I see that before the preferred option was the Global Carbon Incentive Fund, but now we've seen that linking between the ETS of California and Mexico. So I want to ask you very quickly, I want to raise your hand if you selected the first option. Just raise it just the virtual hand so I can see you. So I'm going to select one to share your experience. There's 5 of you, I see, okay. So only one, so maybe just one is willing to share with us. So David Kane, can you share with us why do you think this is the right option? I'm going to mute you and you have like a minute.
Okay. I don't feel that this is perfect, and there is no perfect way to address this issue. All of the options have merit, but California has a emission trading system. I'm not a big fan of that, but I think it's a reasonable step because we share a common border with Mexico. There's many people from Mexico in our state. So there's somewhat a cultural alignment, which I think is important to begin with. I think that over the long haul, we have in California the same challenge of synchronizing the policy in the state with the rest of the country, which I'm hoping will be cap and trade, HR 763. And so we in Mexico and perhaps other countries can work on this together. We can help Mexico, Mexico can help California, and we arrive at a better place.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. All right, so I'm gonna lower their hand. And now I want to hear like who selected the second option and wants to share with us.
Okay, so I think given the political times in our country, I think it will be a safe route to try to pursue in order to build upon the legal framework that we already have and try to tweak it, as Gabby said, to work. And that way, if we link it to California, we can push Mexico to do more, because we've been seeing a lot of talking and not a lot of action. And I feel like this is the option that gives a sense of more action that we need.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we cannot hear about the other option. We need to return, but I am so thankful for all of you to be here with us. We're going to share now. Yes, that is the link to go to the main room. I think like if we put it in the chat as well, people can click on it and then move. One second, I'm getting, do you have it? Tell me if you can put it there.
That would be a great idea if I actually have it. People can also, of course, it's the same room we were in before, so hopefully they will know how to get there.
Okay, I got it.
Okay,
I'm
great.
Gonna here.
So thank you, folks, and feel free to head on over.
Yes, we'll see you there.